эмоционального контекста. Специфика заключается в том, что совершенно странным образом поменялись паттерны развития по регионам и по странам. Значит, есть разные оценки, но я просто буду оперировать в данном своем докладе оценками Международного валютного фонда. Есть альтернативные оценки, у нас есть оценки Всемирного банка, OECD, но пропорции оказываются достаточно примечательными. Мы видим, что традиционно очень хорошо выглядит регион Восточной и Юго-Восточной Азии. Правда, как опять-таки традиционно, но не во всех сегментах. Если убрать оттуда Китай, то картинка меняется очень радикально. Следующий регион, который в наименьшей степени пережил проблемы прошлого года, сюрприз, это регион Африки южнее Сахары. Он упал ниже всех. В смысле, темпы его падения были ниже всех, за исключением региона Азии. И здесь есть как традиционное объяснение, но если бы была Наталья Васильевна Зубаревич, она бы вам сказала, что те, которые растут медленнее всего, они и падают медленнее всего. Но с другой стороны, зная, что происходит в данном регионе с точки зрения изменения потоков экспорта, это есть некая задачка, которая на самом деле нетривиальная. Дальше у нас есть провалившиеся два региона еврозоны и Латинская Америка и Карибский бассейн. И здесь, когда мы говорим про регионы, да, их сопоставление, вот чем Латинская Америка отличается от Африки южнее Сахары? Что Африка южнее Сахары работает только на китайский рынок, а Латинская Америка еще и на американский. Масса проблем, которые упираются в недостаточность традиционных объяснений. Если мы посмотрим, какие объяснения различий в темпах экономического спада за прошлый год предъявлялись научной аудитории, то мы поймем, что их на самом деле 4. И в зависимости от того, какой из этих факторов или групп факторов нанес наибольший ущерб мировой экономике в прошлом году, мы можем говорить о том, что, может быть, его изменение и, так сказать, адаптация к нему позволит соответствующим странам восстановиться быстрее. Если мы посмотрим на общий набор этих факторов, то, в общем, ну, первое, понятно, это медицинские факторы, да, много болеют или мало болеют, много умирают или мало умирают. Второе, это какие меры вводятся с точки зрения борьбы с коронавирусом, насколько они жесткие, там, есть ли это карантин или какие-то более мягкие варианты. Третье, это структура экономики и характер внешнеэкономических связей. Это, собственно говоря, то, что, так сказать, в первую очередь все начинают анализировать и упираются вот в такие парадоксальные вещи, которые, значит, я только что озвучил, да, по регионам и по странам, как вы потом увидели. Ну и, наконец, характер антикризисной политики. Значит, если не вдаваться в тонкие дискуссии, то можно сказать, что по прошлому году главным фактором был второй. Если вы хотите узнать, какие страны упали меньше всего, ищите страны, которые не вводили жесткие ограничения. И здесь, опять-таки, это традиционная, опять для экономистов, проблема. Значит, сразу выясняется, что экономисты такие вот бессердечные, они там готовы платить жизнями людей за какой-то процентный пункт роста ВВП, ничего не бессердечно. Вот хоть режьте, хоть, так сказать, делайте, что хотите, но фактор вот такой. Значит, если мы смотрим по странам, то мы видим вот эту самую парадоксальную картину. Такую же парадоксальную, как и по региону. Значит,
you have an economic development. So Eurozone and India had the lowest tempos of development. Why? Do they have the same structure of export? Do they have the same structure of economy?
С точки зрения
Do
заражения
they
и смерти,
have
ничего подобного. Эти группы
similar criteria of morbidity and mortality? No, no. They have the strictest lockdowns. You may remember the photos from India when police officers were using sticks to keep people off the streets. And Russia is the most similar to the USA. Did we have the same anti-crisis policy? No, not at all. We had similar problems in developing internal markets or external markets? No. We just had the most lenient lockdowns. Look at Japan, look at South Korea. They are islands. South Korea has borders with only one country and it has no links with that country. So everything is exported and imported via sea or via air. And we can say that Korea had much better starting point back in 2019. And that is why absolute figures of GDP decrease is lower. But we can see other countries with similar problems where we do not observe the same effect. So Russia, we can say that Russia gained from, and here is this ratio I've been talking about. So South Korea and Japan, Russia and India, Europe and India, Russia and the USA. And you can see similarities and you can see the discrepancies. And the most important explanation is that the major factor over there is the limitations of anti-COVID policy, lockdowns and quarantines. So countries are similar just by that factor, and the discrepancies in lockdown measures also demonstrate why, unlike in the crisis of 2008, we did not have proper coordination. You may remember that then we have summits, we had common objectives, we had common policies. There was consensus that time. This time there was no consensus, and we're not going to have any consensus because everything is defined at the nation level. And it is because of different lobbying groups within different countries, which lobby for or against lockdowns. In Russia, we have good news. The prices coming up for oil and gas, and the prices came back to the same level they used to be at before the decline. It's great. But South Korea, for example, does not depend on fossil fuel exports. And neither do other countries like South Korea. And they were not influenced by the changing prices on oil and gas. So the only explanation, again, is the severity of lockdown and quarantine measures. And here is the situation about the European zone. You may remember wonderful discussions about Sweden, that they did not have severe restrictions. Maybe Sweden is going to fare better, and in Norway, in Denmark, everything is the same because of the restrictions. And yes, Scandinavia survived through the crisis better. But on the other hand, if you remember the discussions about Sweden, what did we discuss? We did not discuss whether quarantine should be implemented or not. We talked about the trust of the society to the government, to the institution, and we were talking that people, if they trust, if they have confidence in their government, they will have quarantine and they will have vaccines. And it was the same in Denmark and Finland. So it is about the efficient political institutions, even without very strict limitations about quarantine and lockdown. And look to the left. Here you can see the Indostan Peninsula. You can compare India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So the density of population or anti-crisis policy is better in Bangladesh. No, they just did not have any restrictions. And the same about the post-Soviet era. You can compare Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and now we have great discussions why the Tajikistan President Rahmon speaks so assertively on the international arena, because we do not have the crisis, he can say. He can say that we can have economic growth, and that's objective reality. What does it mean for Russia? First, the most important factor is very strict limitations. It's too late to grow if we take them away, because we do not have them anyway. So if we are to look for points of growth, we should pay our attention to some other things which are not connected with the major points of crisis as we know them today. I can list them very briefly. And the multiplicity of these reasons is also the reason of the last few years. We used to define one or two factors, and now we have several challenges. First, the dynamics of the pandemic. The coronavirus is here and it's here to stay. How is it going to mutate? How fast can we work out new vaccines? I asked these questions to experts. Can we think that within the 2-3 years, the virus will be back mutating so fast or so slow that the vaccines will work? And nobody knows the correct answer. Nobody knows whether the present vaccines are going to work or not. And of course, it's very difficult to make forecasts. For example, last year, we couldn't have envisaged such rate of mortality as we have. The other challenge is that the growth of the markets can stop. Right now, formally, the markets have been restored, and S&P 500 diagram, my favorite one, this is quite a growth that's skyrocketing during the plague. And if we put it together with this graph, we understand that there are risks of correcting and adapting these two phenomena. And we've been talking about stimulation, investments, and incentives. And right now, the inflation in the USA is such which has not been present for 30 years. It has not happened since Carter times or Reagan times. How far can it go together with the growth of fund markets? And there are also technical factors. We grow, and then we fall down. When investors, for example, start selling their equipment, it's quite a possible scenario. What about midterm thing? Here are the so-called Russian jaws. We could have written some mug of a wolf, for example, but this is the dynamics of our population income. And we can talk about negative external factors, the growth of GDP, because of the budget, because of the finance, and because of mega investment projects, but that does not increase the income of the population. See that our income grows slower rather than GDP. It is our model of economic development, and the demand from the population is not enough to support the Russian economy. We cannot expect the income of the population to influence that. The regulatory innovations, fortunately, Glasgow summit was in vain. but many countries would like to implement the carbon tax plus sanctions. I'm not saying who is to blame, whether it is good, whether it is bad, but we know that if a whale dies in the ocean, somebody will blame the Russian Federation, and we will be punished for that somehow. And again, there is this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's not about Karabakh anymore. And we have bilateral relations, and we have these relations within the regional security structures as well, which is very, very serious and important. And I also have to mention that the influence of demographic losses on our labor market and on our consumption. We used to have very small influence of demography impact on labor market. The loss of time was not about mortality, but about restrictions, and everybody believed that after the vaccine we will have lower rate of disease. But right now we have 1,200 people dying per day, so that will be 500,000 per year. Maybe it's the peak situation right now, but we do not have the statistical data for the beginning of the year either. And that is terrible. That is terrible demography. And some skeptics say that mostly old people die who are off the labor market. But I do not know what's going to happen next year. And we're going to have lots of issues with demand, and it will be a terrible impact to the social capital. Our education suffers a lot, and we will have long-term consequences in higher education later on. I'm very pessimistic about that. We can be happy that there is some development of distant learning, online education, and in higher education it somehow works, but in high school and middle school it does not work at all. And we will have terrible problems within 5 years. There will be 1 or 2% loss in our growth of GDP. And of course, it would be great if these scenarios do not happen, but they are happening right now, and we should think about our short-term and long-term policy, how to react. And thank you for your attention. Sorry for being that pessimistic. We have questions from YouTube. They ask if there is any link between restrictions in regions and the real figures, real numbers of decline in the pandemic development. Qualitatively, to demonstrate in the qualitative sense this correlation between lower dynamic of regional development and restrictions, it's just plain impossible, because regions are very, very different. Besides, the mechanisms of developing the links are different, and the budgets are different. So if you increase something or restrict something by 1% and your regional development product will decrease or increase 1%, we cannot give you this precise correlation. But yes, there is a general correlation. The more restrictions there is, the more decline there is, for example, in the sphere of transportation, food, and cinemas and theaters. Cinema and theaters, museums, it's even impossible to comment already. We had limitations, restrictions during the November holidays, and it was prohibited to go to a museum. It's dangerous, but yes, you can go to Turkey on vacation. That's just stupid, plain stupid. We should not do things like that. Thank you for your honest response. And shall we continue? Shall we appoint the next speaker?
Хорошо, тогда я попрошу тоже нашего спикера, давнего и хорошего друга Тимачева Юрия Вячеславовича, директора по экономической политике НИУ Высшей школы.
Very well. Then I invite Mr. Yuri Timachev from the Higher School of Economics, who will talk about the effects for Russian companies and the key challenges for the Russian industrial policy. You're welcome. Hello, dear colleagues. I'm very honored and pleased to be invited. I'm always very grateful, and it's very interesting always to participate in the discussions at the venue of the Ural Federal University. And I would like to talk a little bit about the post-pandemic and pandemic trends of development. As Sergey said, optimistically, we do not know when it is going to stop or how it is going to continue. And I would first like to dwell on the challenges for the industrial policy. I'm not sure if my speech is going to be pessimistic or optimistic. So the three key topics are, first, global challenges that are important because they affect the company and they are important from the government's policy viewpoint. Secondly, it's the crisis, the impact of the crisis on companies, what can happen and what trends we can observe, especially at the micro level, and the challenges for the industrial policies that should be identified at the moment. So the global challenges. I'm not talking about the challenges that are happening right now, the second. I'm talking about the long-term challenges that have been discussed multiple times, but they have been enhanced during the pandemic. And as usual, a challenge is both a problem and an opportunity. Firstly, it's the industrial revolution. So what can be considered to be challenge here. Firstly, it's the technology gaps between big and small companies, exporters and non-exporters. It's a polarization of jobs when jobs with medium skill level are disappearing and only low skill and high skill jobs remain. This is a significant change of business models. Everyone knows this about these disruptive technologies when a certain marketplace is transformed completely. Also something that we are only beginning to feel, but everyone is starting to discuss it actively, although maybe not so much in Russia, is the changes of tax revenues in the future, particularly lower contributions for social purposes due to automation, and about also the discussion about how the value-added tax is going to look like and whether it will also be affected. And finally, the shift from industry 3.0 to 4.0 and the growing role of startups and science. And again, it's a challenge for the policy because the policy has to be different. The second thing is about the industrial policy. That's one of the areas here, digitization and digital transformation. And it has to do with creating digital platforms, monopolizing certain areas. And along with that, access to new markets is getting expanded, particularly for small companies. Competitors are, there is greater competition among suppliers. It's easier to access the market, but harder to compete there. It's developing the gig economy related to remote work, and it's a challenge for the government, whom to protect and under what conditions. Servicization, when the share of people involved in provision of services is expanding, which is very difficult to monitor. And finally, the industry borders are also growing weaker due to digitization. So this entails a crisis of industry-specific regulation, and we need some other principles of regulation. Number three is transformation of global supply chains. We are shifting from chains to networks, and the role of digital platforms as hubs in these networks are becoming more important. It's so elements in these chains may vary because they can be appointed via digital platforms, and most importantly, the very format of this value-adding curve within the value chain is also changing. So we now have a W-shaped curve when production also has a very high added value, simply because the role of customization is growing and we have more high-tech services like in Germany. So production is becoming completely different. And the most important thing we are seeing is there is no great driver. Value supply chains are not created based on where you can find cheap suppliers. These chains are now dependent on specific assets and specific skills. So certain countries can no longer win only through low prices. Number 4, globalization and regionalization. I just wanted to mention a very high level of conflict and very complex interdependencies between companies and unpredictable consequences of direct actions. For example, you can impose restrictions, but the pandemic has shown how complicated real supply chains are. And when you're trying to move production to other countries at a certain level of the chain, doesn't mean you're no longer dependent on a certain country, because you're still dependent on this country at a certain level, even though you want to avoid it. So trade wars are more just for the sake of demonstration, while the consequences are unpredictable, because you cannot clearly predict how the positive and negative effects are going to travel along this chain. It's always unexpected. Non-economic challenges, as Sergey was saying, it's ESG agenda, it's the environment, efficient and clean energy. But I'd like to emphasize that these estimates are really non-accurate, and the views here are very drastic, pro or versus this. And finally, the state. So the jurisdictions are competing because businesses are more mobile, and intangible assets are becoming more important. So businesses can simply move to the economy or the country where it's more efficient, where it's easier to build a certain business, and where the government and the state is friendlier. And secondly, governments are becoming more active. Developed countries actually dislike active government role, but when they see the China's example, they cannot avoid mimicking some of China's measures in their policy. For example, as soon as Germany introduced its Industry 4.0 program, all the neighboring countries immediately adopted similar measures, regardless of their views. And Germany had its own emphasis, and it knew why it was doing it, while other countries were simply mimicking this approach. And these are the global challenges that we need to respond to somehow. So what are the general views about changing the economy within the catch-up development, because we're certainly catching up? The first classical approach is moving upwards to higher value adding in traditional resource sectors. The second approach is leapfrogging the industry development, bypassing a certain stage, like in IT, where we have achieved that. Thirdly, it's the new development path set by the Industrial Revolution, new opportunities and new market development prospects. And finally, the new bifurcations in development, like non-economic global challenges related to the health, environment, and so on. So these are the main approaches, and we can select several at a time. But for us, the business environment is critical, otherwise the risks would be too high. It's balancing between market gaps and government gaps. It's difficult to strike this balance, then it's accumulating systemic changes, a critical mass. Otherwise, the innovations will just be eliminated by the already existing groups of interests, and building new groups of interests that are oriented towards these changes. Why is there a high demand for an industrial policy in Russia? I'm not sure. This looks great in the slide, but nevertheless, labor productivity is low, 2 or 3 times lower, 60, and it's not only because of the level of technology, it's also because of the level of organization. Because when you look at this productivity level, it's debatable. Sometimes it's about poorly developed management systems. Secondly, we are looking at loan rows here. So this is the data for 15 or 20 years. And the key share is Russia's share in the global export of advanced products. It's very low, and it's very and also as this space is properly organized. Exporters survive for 2 or 3 years instead of longer survivability of exporters in foreign countries. So this indicator, for example, 11% of the specific share of high-tech companies, that's 9 to 11%. So we have below 1% of companies that produce innovative global products. And how is the Russian export developing over the past 20 years? By our estimates, it's associated with low added value industries by 80–90%. And if we are expanding our export through low added value products, we are moving towards the pitfall of medium income. So this is the general trend. This price competitiveness is working worse and worse. So we need to understand what countries we are going to compete with and how, because we certainly cannot reduce the wages, and we cannot damage, we don't want to damage the environment. So how are we going to compete? And finally, SME is not playing a big role in the economy. This sector's position is now changing. It used to have a social role, but now it's actually it has a transformational role. It drives structural changes. For example, the Industry 4.0 is mostly driven by a combination of startups, unlike Industry 3.0 that's driven by big companies. Are there any good things here? Well, lots of them, and we know about them. The point is, the good things are not rolled out and deployed across the economy. In this slide, you can see some examples of pitfalls that we can face. I'm not going to describe each of them, but the pitfalls of today are objective. It's integrating the business in the vertical hierarchy and unstable taxation system and interventions, government's intervention in prices. The impact of the crisis. First of all, this is a unique crisis because it caused changes in different directions. There were some winners in all industries, and this time mostly innovative, active, and dynamic companies were the winners, so it has a positive structural effect. But these companies are few and far between, and as Sergey was talking about the list of countries, well, I'm interested in the experience of countries like Israel, South Korea, and Sweden, where the number of winning companies winning during the crisis, their share was not much lower than the number of losers, companies losing from the crisis. In our case, the winners account for 5 to 10% of companies, and in Kazakhstan, it's almost zero. So everyone lost because of the crisis. And of course, when we have such huge changes and populations demands and consumer demand is changing so drastically. Some companies could win by satisfying this demand, but it depends on the environment, how your business is oriented towards entrepreneurship, or whether it's just your way of survival. So did companies become more digitized? Did they shift to remote work or customization? Well, actually, the crisis accelerated the processes that were already in progress, that were launched before the pandemic. The pandemic just accelerated and enhanced them. And here you can see the online sales, and you can see how Russia has a huge share of online sales compared to other post-Soviet countries. This is a big World Bank survey, and you can see that Russian companies mostly avoided firing people, so they took care of their human resources, but they shifted to online sales. Companies started selling online, and Russia really relied on this driver a lot. So what trends can we see? And it is these trends that actually determine the challenges. Firstly, it's a huge economy divergence. We know that there are gaps of productivity, but also low productivity companies are not improving it. They're not motivated to, and high productivity companies are becoming even more productive. So this gap is growing wider. And also there is a huge gap between exporting and non-exporting companies. These are two different worlds, cultures, behaviors, and so on. And of course, all of that is superimposed on regional differences. The access to technologies varies and creates an additional gap. This certainly has to do with business digitization, which is very uncertain, because we don't know how the business is going to respond. Yes, there is a digital gap between big and small companies. Yes, there is new monopolization that has to be regulated, but small businesses also get access to new markets that it never used to have in the past. Look at ozone, for example, or cost cutting. And at the company level, for example, in banks, it's obvious. We can see that business is digitizing and flattening its hierarchical structures, and there is a new culture where software developers bring their culture to other companies. Number three, changing hiring models, remote employment, gig economy, which means flexibility and mobility. But on the other hand, we have social divergence and regional disparities, because value added can be created in one country or region, while the infrastructure, medical, and transportation costs are incurred by another region, and this is growing stronger. And also, we cannot really say whether it's good or not, because indeed there is, I think, a gap in the human capital, because, for example, when university students are studying online in their first or second year, it creates big problems. It's okay when the processes are already established, but you cannot launch new projects remotely. And another big trend is that big companies are swallowing medium promising firms, called insourcing. And again, you can say that these companies may diversify and that they will acquire best knowledge. But on the other hand, we can see that subcontracting chains are growing smaller, and it's decorporatization. And when subcontracting chains are growing smaller, it's bad, because we are just having smaller national chains that could be integrated into global chains. Then personification of the business, another trend, when businesses are saying, so, okay, so when we were talking about creating retail shareholders, it's maybe no longer so, because the public wants to have a person to identify with a business. And also you can see that there are more and more differences between national and international companies. It has to do with the import substitution and intangible assets regulation, intellectual property regulation, which makes this gap wider. And there are also profound changes in our notions of the business and of life, and this is very long term. but it deserves its own discussion. And finally, the bifurcations. Firstly, it's the strict selection in regulation. It's either satisfying the needs of the population or focusing on developing national production. This bifurcation always exists, but now it's growing more important. Secondly, it's either international regulation or protecting your national specific features. For example, when we are saying that we can take this, but avoid taking that, and impose compulsive licensing and so on. There are some benefits associated with it, and there are some losses, but this deserves a more profound discussion. And finally, the ratio of conventional and new formats, because we still have limitations on online sales. It's good that we have rapidly expanded the capability of selling certain products, like medical products, during the pandemic, but some limitations still exist in the online trade. So these are just some of the things we have identified. And finally, the challenges for the industrial policy in Russia. Firstly, there is a definite trend towards verticalization and creating hierarchies. Of course, it's because we want to accelerate the changes and create big demand to drive these systemic changes, as I have mentioned, because we are trying to disrupt this local equilibrium that has been established. But then there is a big risk of imitation, insufficient initiative from below, from companies and regions, accumulating errors because no one is motivated to solve these problems on time, and poor deployment of changes because we have some achievements and good results, but there is no environment for them to spread in the economy. Secondly, it's the government having more impact on the business, indirect impact, and we can see that big companies with partially state-owned are more active investors, which is clear because they're in the public sector, but their investments are not as efficient. Thirdly, government's attention to the business environment, it's classical. So the government is trying to take some care of the small businesses during the crisis, but as soon as the crisis goes away, this is no longer so. Everyone admits that there is a huge pressure on the small business, but no one is doing anything about it except during the crisis. Next, supporting structural changes. Now the government is coming to new sectors, but government support is pretty toxic because it's frightening. People are afraid to use government support measures, and this means that even good faith companies are trying to avoid these risks. Next, breakthrough innovations mean that there is a risk of bubbles in the market. Abroad, it's mostly private companies that are involved in the market, but in Russia, new developments are funded by the government by 2/3, not private companies. Next, change drivers. These are big companies and organizations owned by the state. It's not very sensitive to innovations. And while small and medium-sized businesses are not focusing on the social role. Next, digitization of the public system. Yes, the whole system of digitizing public services is already working, and it lowers the businesses and the population's costs. But this creates an impression that the government can plan everything and manage the whole process completely and understand what to distribute where. Next, strategy. There are multiple strategies, and we feel that they are mostly aimed at redistributing resources, and they are not very much oriented towards this desired image of the economy. It's talking about the strategy is talking about threats, and it's not clearly speaking to the population about what we want to achieve. And finally, priorities. This enhanced competition among development tasks and social tasks between the long-term and the short-term This is a powerful competition, and there is no single point where we can discuss this. Different ministries are in charge of different things, and for example, if we are starting to talk about competition here, it's Ministry of Industry and Trade that's talking about it, not the Ministry of Economic Development, which seems a bit strange. Now it's the Ministry of Industry and Trade is talking about the poor environment, because it noticed that these vertical supply chains created problems during the pandemic when the chains are not responding quickly. That's it. I'm finished. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much for this profound and interesting speech. Our YouTube audience is still thinking, but maybe the experts who are present here can ask a question. Turn on your microphone, please, because we need to be heard. My name is Mr. Elisoyedov. I have a good faith question. I'm not a huge professional in that. I used to be a candidate of sciences. Now I'm a doctor of sciences in psychology and sociology. But the question is, how our SMEs, whether our SMEs can be called hidden champions, and what are the differences? Our SMEs definitely have this category. And when I was talking about quickly growing companies, I actually meant this category of hidden champions. The problem is our policy, when I was talking about the social aspect concerning the small and medium enterprises, it's mostly, the policy is mostly aimed at helping them start, creating a favorable environment for micro business. But the policy is objectively not helping companies grow. There are almost no support tools for companies dependent on the dynamics of their development. And that's the difference. The American SME policy is more growth oriented. Let some of them fail, but the stronger companies will survive. The European policy has to do with the employment and the social mission, but everyone is now saying that we need to pay more attention to faster growing companies. And again, it's a shift, because faster growing companies are mostly from medium-sized enterprises. And during the pandemic, the medium-sized enterprises were in a kind of a gap, because big companies have lobbying opportunities, and the government always takes into account the interests of the big business, which is as it should be. And small businesses, well, we all realize that small business needs support, but medium-sized businesses are somewhere in between. No one is taking great care of that. Thank you. And our colleagues from YouTube are asking, Mr. Alexander Trachtenberg is asking, we cannot impact the governor's decrees concerning the infection. How can business affect regulation? Maybe an independent anti-corruption expert review. Could you comment on that? Well, you know, first of all, it has to do with the model of activity of the regional administration, whether the regional administration is motivated and customer-oriented, so to say. When we were looking at that during the crisis, all regions are different. In some cases, the businesses were saying it's great. In other cases, some draconian measures were imposed with no good reason. In some regions, the administration is meeting the business regularly, in some cases not. And there was an active interaction with the business during the pandemic, but at the federal level, by the Ministry of Industry and Trade, but not at the regional level, not always. And if we have another formal tool, I think the good regions will use them, but worse regions, poorer regions will not benefit from them. Thank you. And we are moving on.
And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Gimpelson from the Academy of Sciences again. Can digital transformation and improvement of productivity become very important factors of economic growth? Thank you very much. It's a very good question. And of course, it is very difficult to answer it in the positive, but we have our doubts. When we discuss how digitalization and automatization, robotization, how they can influence economic development, you understand that a lot depends on the channels. To increase productivity, you either have to produce more with the same resources or cut down on the consumption of resources or combine the two. And as digitalization looks here, I cannot see it properly. It's not quite obvious because 70–80% of our people are in the services. And in the services sector, growth of productivity is much more complicated rather than in industry, and it's harder to obtain. As for our industry, it has been more or less digitalized, but the services sector, we do have digitalization, for example, of trade, but how does it correlate with the growth of productivity? We cannot see clearly because there are other factors working over there. Consumption, for example, Sergei Alexandrovich has mentioned, and the consumer's demand is pretty limited, as it has been mentioned. And we had interesting data from the Росстат. They started calculating wages not only by studying the enterprises, but also on the data given by the pension fund. And the distribution of wages is very dramatic, is much more dramatic if we look at the pension fund data. The average wage is about 30,000, and then the median wage is even lower, and I think that they are slightly increasing the numbers. Not all the data are calculated properly, and of course, digitalization will help us in some ways and will make our life a bit easier. But how can it become a factor of long-term economic growth and the growth of productivity? I cannot see an obvious correlation. We do need time to see that. Besides, the trends of digitalization started before the pandemic, and the pandemic only speeded them up. Digitalization does open up some window of opportunities, but this window is going to be closed quite fast. So maybe productivity will grow eventually, but the tempo of this growth is not quite clear. Besides, we know that all long-term global forecasts say that there is nothing optimistic or positive about long-term growth. And before the pandemic, we had talked about the decreased growth. I do not think these pessimistic forecasts are going to be changed in the nearest future. Besides, there are other factors overlapping these trends. Mr. Afontsov referred to the demographic problems in his report. And he said he was pessimistic, but he's very optimistic in comparison to me. He is even a naive optimist in comparison to me, and I hope he will not be offended. Nobody has called me romantic or naive optimist for a long time. It may need a separate discussion, but the forecasts before the pandemic, before the COVID situation, had spoken that by 2030, the number of employed within the age of 20 to 40 will decrease by 40%, from 33–34 million to about 26–25 million. I think it's a terrible situation. And when we talk about digitalization, it's for the young, and the average age of a programmer in our country is 29. And I think that after 40, they stop writing codes and they go to other spheres. This knowledge can get outdated very fast. And the younger the person, the easier it is for this person to follow these changes. And the decreasing number of young people means that there will be less and less people capable of these economic and scientific innovations. Of course, there are other issues connected with strategic challenges, and they include education, health sphere, and I think that the COVID pandemic highlighted a lot of difficult problems. And there is one more thing I wanted to mention, is the problem of trust. And we can see the attitude to vaccination. It demonstrates the problem of trust. And how can we develop our economy without trust? I cannot see it. When we look at the data of creating jobs and losing jobs, and they correlate to productivity, of course, and the number of lost jobs is very high, and the growth of creating new jobs is very, very slow, and it is quite a problem. That's about all I wanted to say. Thank you. While our YouTube viewers prepare their questions, I would like to pass the floor to other colleagues for the comments. Thank you very much for your explanations, and I understood that still I'm not a naive and romantic optimist. I spoke only about pandemic losses connected with pandemics, without touching upon those fundamental processes you've been talking about. But I also wanted to ask you the following question, again, connected with the young cohort, with the young people. For several decades, we've been discussing that young people at their most creative age, unfortunately, they go abroad, and it is very unfortunate for our economy. How, in your opinion, how can it influence our development? What can we do? What assessments do you have over here? I cannot speak about different assessments. And of course, pandemics change the situation somehow. And of course, the losses increased. But a lot depends on the opportunities we have here. And we should understand that irrespective of the field, there are opportunities to do science, but the wages over there are very, very low. It means that young researchers cannot concentrate on their research. And you know it perfectly well that they have to earn some money on the side, and it happens in all institutions of higher education. And it means that the potential we have is not used fully. And when young people, even if they do not think of going abroad, yet they're pretty limited in using their potential. And I published an article in the journal "Вопросы экономики," issues of economy, and I asked whether we need social capital at all. And I had 10 points where I doubted that. And I think we do have problems we have to discuss.
огорчение.
And of course, there is a problem over here.
Ну, давайте, если у нас в конце, да, оставим ваш краткий диалог с Сергеем
And
Александровичем,
in the end,
да, когда, ну,
we
вы знаете,
remember the old joke about an optimist and pessimist. And when the pessimist says it can't be worse, and the optimist says, yes, it can, yes, it can. So let's proceed to stick to the schedule, and I will invite Mr. Sannikov, the director of Center of Macroeconomic Analysis and Forecasting. And we should think how we can assess the new measures of support and what points of growth we have. Thank you, colleagues, and good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you for inviting me at this conference. And last year I was prevented by COVID. I was ill right before the conference. So what I would like to say, I would like to talk about industry as well, about the current issues, but later on I will give you a broader context. Now I share the screen.
Не могу, наверное, утверждать, что я буду говорить абсолютно какие-то новые
I
вещи.
cannot say that I'm going to say something new.
На мой взгляд, важные, и поэтому их
But
очень важно.
in my opinion, I'm going to highlight very important things. First of all,
Что вот формально,
what do we have right now? Right now, we have a very interesting situation. Let's look at the development of our economy.
очень неплохие результаты. Я
We
бы даже сказал,
can see that we have very good results. I would even say unexpectedly good results at the backdrop of the pandemics, and taking into consideration the bad expectations we had.
Динамика доходов.
And we have the dynamics of growth, dynamics of income, investment activity. Everywhere we have positive dynamics.
Это
And that
естественно.
is about industry, of course. Situation is different in the services sector. So if we talk about the core industries, we have growth over here.
Это рост доходов.
X-axis is income, and
Тем лучше. И вот мы видим, что
the higher you go, the better the situation it is, and to the right, the better it is. And you can see the sectors in the upper right corner are growing, and there are specific clusters over here. Everything is clearly seen,
Я как бы не
but
буду.
unfortunately, I do not have time to give you too many details. Yet,
Даже там, в
the
общем-то,
industries where you have negative growth, sometimes it is very temporary. For example,
там нет
this left down
ограничений там.
corner, it's about oil and gas, that's about the price decrease, but
Чувствует
it
себя
was
вроде
temporary, and now the
очень
prices jumped back. The industry is not feeling well yet, but it is only for the first 6 months of this year. And we know that everything is going to improve pretty soon.
позитивный как бы зон.
And by the end of the year, every industry will be in the positive upper right corner.
На первый взгляд.
And it's only at the first sight, I would like to emphasize that. But if we look deeper,
Это чуть позже. Я еще хотел сказать про вот этих точек.
we can see that the situation is different. And about the points of growth you've mentioned.
Вот, ну, 4, скажем так.
Traditionally,
точки,
even
говоря,
before
вот.
crisis, we had 4 points of growth.
Это 4 сегмента.
That is
Промышленный,
4
химический,
sectors.
промышленный.
That is fuel, agriculture, chemistry, and lumber production.
Там высоких темпов-то и
In
сложно.
some sectors, the growth was not very fast because, well, it is just natural not to have huge growth. But in chemical industry and lumber industry, the growth was very, very good.
Топливный помедленнее.
And that has been for the last 5 years or so. And agricultural industry was okay.
Ресурсы, как лидер.
And after the crisis or during the crisis,
отчасти угля, хотя
energy resources
ну, у нас добавились
lagged behind a bit because of oil, for example, but we received new leaders, pharmaceutical industry, for example, the super leader, but also there was some growth in the long-term used goods, and they became points of growth as
просто был
well.
бум настоящий.
On some markets, there was a boom. For example, cars, number of cars sold. Right now, not everything is very good. They are here to the left.
Итог того, что просто нарушаются
That
цепочки.
is the result of the transportation links broken. And right now, Avtovaz has stopped just because they do not have some specific spare parts, some electronics. And as for our policy in this area,
политику комплексно, это там отдельная большая
a
история.
complex assessment of this policy is a matter for a separate report and a huge one. But I can tell you that the policy was pretty controversial in general. Most likely it was kind of anti-crisis policy and social policy oriented at society, and that was felt that by our entrepreneurs that we should provide for some stability, for some social situation. And of course, we can say that our policy was oriented at supporting the people. It was not the worst possible policy ever.
Социальная политика, ну, в проекции на реальный сектор, она
when we talk about the controversies of the social policy, we can mention that there were, of course, limitations, restrictions.
И это, конечно, создавало
the price increases were sort of limited, stopped, and it was not very good for investment decisions because it was there was a lot of uncertainty what was going to happen tomorrow, a lot of uncertainty because of the pandemic situation and because of this difficult policy, controversial policy. For example, quotas were going to be implemented or tariffs were going to be increased or duties could be increased. But now I would like to talk about the future of our policy. That is the most interesting part. And here we have three different prospects: short-term, mid-term, and long-term prospects. And I hear a negative balance over here. If we talk about risks and challenges, there are more risks and challenges rather than any positive things. Short term, there is this growth of demand for fuels, for energy resources. Gas and oil are in the red. And the September numbers were very good for industry already because of the growth of fossil fuel prices, and it is going to keep on working. But on the other hand, the demand is going down quite soon. And there is a new negative factor, is that consumption went from services to goods, and right now, together with our getting over with the pandemic, although the pandemic is not ending, it's somehow going on, but if we think that the pandemic is going to come to an end, then the people will switch over to services again, and our positions are weak over there, and there will be this negative flow concerning tourism,
экономической динамики это
and
будет
other things. So for our economy, it's going to be
несрочно, конечно.
negative. It's going to have negative consequences, but that's short-term prospects. As for
Пока сегодня
midterm,
поговорили, но на самом деле, что
unfortunately, we
наблюдаем?
have not been speaking about it today yet. In global
Видим
economy,
результаты проекции на нас. Это мощнейший разбалансирование.
we see the huge disbalancing of markets,
Уже полгода,
and it's a very interesting phenomenon.
так сказать, этой пандемии. Понятно,
18 months of the pandemic are over,
когда
and
говорили еще, ну вот
the transportation links were broken and the markets were disbalanced, and we had
у нас
discussed
это
that even before the pandemic situation. We did have those problems, and other countries also had those problems before the pandemics. And 18 months later, this disbalance
это
is
очень интересный,
growing,
странный феномен.
and it is a strange phenomenon, and it leads
Наблюдаем прежде всего на товарных рынках,
to
commodities.
what we see at our commodities markets, where the prices are
Все про это в курсе,
rocketing
да?
up.
Хотя, кстати,
And
не только
everybody has noticed that not only commodities, there are
в курсе про
other indicators.
индекс цен на грузовые перевозки.
For example, the prices for containers, which
Это что, кажется, да?
grew
То есть,
by factor of 4. That's such a terrible disbalance that nobody could have thought of that. And the European energy market and other energy markets
и, честно
are
говоря,
also
мне вот
disbalanced.
очень непонятно,
This disbalance is huge, and I do not understand when
никто не ожидал.
we can put it to rights again, because nobody had expected such disbalance. Of course, we had been discussing these disbalancing issues, but we had not expected this huge, unprecedented disbalance.
Даже предположить.
Nobody could have expected. A year ago, if a year ago somebody had said that 1,000 cubic meters of gas would cost $1,000, everybody would have thought that person mad. He would have been fired. And the same can be said about containers. Nobody could have predicted the growth of prices fourfold. And that is the reality we have. So this inflation we have because of costs, it's so huge, it's such a serious challenge, and we see the consequences in the consumer prices in the United States. Again, it is at an unprecedented level, and it seems to be only a beginning. And there can be a huge correction of funds and raw materials. And again, there's going to be another disbalance over there. And I do not know what is worse. Maybe inflation is better rather than the disbalance of raw materials. And when we talk about the regulation of this policy, it's difficult to predict either for our own country or globally. It's difficult to predict which regulatory policy is going to be efficient. I have my doubts about that. With this huge disbalance, solutions can be made, and solutions can be pretty dramatic, and very often they will not be very well thought of, and it's very difficult to think of these solutions, and it's necessary to coordinate these policies, but right now everything is so bad about coordinating our policies. it's vice versa. Everybody tries to help their own problems. It's kind of a self-help principle rather than helping others or coordinating efforts with others. And we can go over to yet another issue of global policy. First, and it is very important, that digitalization is here to stay. And the hype went over from digitalization to decarbonization, but digitalization is here to stay, and the risks are here to stay. And we can speak about those risks separately for a long time. And we understand that there are lots of risks over here. And I do not think a lot of these risks are assessed properly. For example, this illegal, intransparent leakage. For example, there are databases which are supposed to be unified databases, but the risks that the data is going to leak somewhere to the black market, we underestimate such risks. And we know that nothing can be absolutely safe and absolutely protected. We understand that there is a risk of leakages over here, and we underestimate such risks. But for us economists, it's very important that digitalization not only increases the productivity, but we should be very adaptive to improved efficiency in one sector, and we should adapt the labor flows. People are fired in some sectors, but they should find their place in other sectors, on other markets. Digitalization exacerbates these challenges, and we have to deal with these challenges somehow. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time to deal with that, and I would like to get back to the issue of decarbonization. As Mr. Simachev correctly pointed out, there are polar opinions are very divided, but the truth is somewhere in between. And this decarbonization is a very good example of what we do about very serious problems. We do not solve them. In my opinion, when we think about the most important things, decarbonization is very, very expensive. Right now, using the current technologies, we globally have to give away 2 of our monthly incomes to decarbonization. It's too expensive. And that decreases this transition price. But basically, 1/12 of our income we will have to give away to cool off our planet. That's the issue. And I think very few people are ready to pay that much money. And it's not quite clear who is going to pay how much. That is the bottleneck. As soon as we go over from declarations to specific steps, we will see that nobody is going to pay, nobody is willing to pay, because that's too much. And yet another important thing, we have the free rider problem, huge free rider problem, because some countries have already made this transition through industrialization, and they did not pay for decarbonization. They are free riders, and other countries which are going through the industrialization stage, they are made to pay, and I don't think they're going to be happy about that. and the balance of wins and losses within every country is very, very disbalanced. Some countries will receive advantages and some countries will receive huge disadvantages. And the Netherlands, for example, can be simply washed away off the face of Earth. And how can we correlate all these different interests? We do not have a mechanism, we do not have an institution to work out this agreement, and most importantly, to enforce this agreement. We need this kind of enforcement, and we have not ever had that kind of enforcement. And all this suggests that we should get prepared. Well, of course, we should do something about cutting down on carbon emissions, but we should get prepared for increases in global temperature. We should get prepared for the consequences. And of course, strategically, we need other solutions, we need other ways. And nobody speaks openly, nobody discusses openly such issues. There are different reasons for that, and the truth is not always said openly. We had a lot of games around it, and this processes going around decarbonizations is just a game, especially if we compare the discussions with real activities. It's just one example. This is the most optimistic forecast of what we're going to have about temperature. In reality, everything is going to be even worse. And we have an ideal storm in front of us, or maybe we are already in it. And what we have right now is just warming up before this huge storm. And on long-term perspective, we have the demographic problems, and this problem is very long term, just like decarbonization, just like the global warming. We are talking about decades, many decades. And I've seen a publication back in 1989 when they described global warming, and at that time they said we have to start working right now, and it was absolutely correct. But that had been published in 1989. 3 decades later, it's too late. We had to start earlier. And the same about demographic situation. Again, if we talk about social changes and social cultural patterns, it's also a very long-term problem. Humanity and the political systems in general are not ready to deal with such long-term issues. We have political cycle very short, and this cycle is much longer. But not only that, the humankind is very much oriented at dealing with short-term issues. I'm sorry, we are lagging behind the schedule. And that is my last slide. I'm coming to an end. You see that these challenges are huge for politicians as well. And I do not know how we're going to deal with these issues. I'm trying to be optimistic here, but unfortunately for the next few years, I do not know what's going to happen in 2050 because the challenges are huge. Unfortunately, I do not have time for that, but I would have answered your questions if you had any. Thank you very much.
You're right. People are not even thinking about the 50 years ahead. And now I'm giving the floor to Mr. Klepachev from the Foreign Economics Bank, who will answer the question about how these changes determine the midterm development of the Russian economy and what are the conditions of the recovery and beginning the economic growth anew. Thank you, Viktor Anatolyevich, dear colleagues. So the question is multi-dimensional about relaunching the economic growth. Well, firstly, as the colleagues have said, we don't need to relaunch it, restart it. We already have economic growth. Our current estimate is a GDP growth of 4.1% and maybe 4.3% industry growth. The GDP would be even higher, would be growing even faster if not for the anti-COVID measures and restrictions on activities that were imposed. The problem is what kind of growth can we expect in the future and how sustainable this growth will be. The official forecast is 3% GDP growth, and a different estimate forecast is 1.8 or maybe 2.5, 2.8 percent. And of course, that's not the kind of growth we would like to see. But in order to stay within the agenda, I will try to focus not even on the midterm, but also on the long-term aspects associated with the industry and the structural shifts in the economy. Because it's clear that in general, the problem of economic growth is quite broad, and the budget is now being adopted by the government. I don't even want to comment on that. There are some aspects related to the central bank's monetary and credit policy. Unlike the US and other countries, our central bank is increasing the interest rate all the time, which does not create opportunities for the economic growth. And we can argue about how we can fight the inflation caused by the growing prices of metals and other resources, but that's mostly caused by foreign countries. And no one is doing that in Europe or the US. So this has both a short-term and a long-term aspect. And this monetary situation that exists in the world, and it sometimes invades our market in the digital area or in the gas market. No one could probably predict that the gas would cost $1,000, but after shifting to the futures trade and a huge amount of money, there will be havoc here, as it periodically happens in other markets, and the scale of this havoc depends on other drivers. But let me return to my subject, the Russian industry and challenges faced by it. Industry in the broad sense of the word, speaking about conventional industrial activities, they account for about 24% of GDP, processing about 13%. And as for employment, if we include small businesses and additional estimates, that's about 18% of employed people. But even if we're talking about Industry 5G or 4G, of course, the definition of industrial activity is being rethought, and it's changing. And what we consider to be conventional industry or software development or telecommunication systems and other services related to cargo transportation, these differences are becoming vague, and we can now speak about industrial or technology activities in general. And then this is about 10% of GDP, or rather high-tech activity accounts for 10% of GDP, and altogether it accounts for 1/3 or about 30% of GDP. Speaking about challenges, it's not only what's written in the industrial policy. We have a state government program on industry development, or even a package of these programs, which is not only about money and indicators. Primarily, this means the public policy in a certain sector, which is reflected in the state program of industry development. I think it's state program number 19, and there are some more targeted programs on aviation, shipbuilding, and so on, besides a special package of measures for the defense industry. But if we try to conceptualize what's happening there, I would identify the three key challenges and dimensions. Firstly, it's import substitution and the country's technology sovereignty. Secondly, it's developing high-tech and medium-tech industries. And thirdly, it's creating an industrial base for a new economy that has to do not only with challenges related to climate change or low carbon development, because climate change is not only about reducing the CO2 emissions, so it's much broader than the green economy, and generally the sustainable development goals. In this regard, I would like to emphasize several aspects. Import substitution. This is not new, and there are numerous solutions in this area, but I wanted to emphasize that with certain even though we have achieved certain results in individual areas, we haven't solved this problem drastically. Our economy in many market segments is critically dependent from the import. A traditional example is, well, if we're talking about microelectronics, the Soviet Union in its time was number 2 in the world by microelectronics output. Now we are not, we don't even account for 1%. We actually have no single factory that would mass produce this product. But there are some results. We have created some design centers. We have developed product line of Russian microprocessors. Unlike China, China is now starting to do that. It's great in terms of memory and components. So these are Elbrus and Baikal processors developed in Russia. That's a big breakthrough for us, despite some problems. Secondly, we have made some steps, and quite significant steps, to develop Russian software, not only specialized software, but also operating systems and software required for design engineering calculations. So we can work not only with General Electric or Siemens software, but Logos, for example, the first revision is ready, and within the next couple of years, another revision will be released. So maybe that's some kind of support list. But looking at the numbers, more than 80% of software used in Russia is imported, which certainly is a great problem in terms of all the sanctions and our sovereignty and the refusal of supplying updated versions to us. And this concerns not only Roscosmos and the United Aerospace Corporation, but even the Bauman University, that never concealed its history, can no longer procure licensed software from foreign companies, which is a huge problem. Regular people, laymen, don't even realize the scope of this problem. I mean, you can take a new electrical train, like Sapsano Lastочка. You can stop a train by sending a signal from a satellite, and this concerns other things as well. So it's not only about defense industry and high tech. Few people know that, for instance, our software controlling our oil pipelines and some nuclear power plants, this software is imported from French. So we really have to stay friendly with France, or the security issue is going to become a problem here. I'm just giving these examples to show, I'm not even talking about aircrafts. There were some problems during the sanctions, even to get some components and software for Boeing and Airbus. And our Sukhoi Superjet is has 80% of imported components. So, and MS-21 that's currently being tested, it's also 50%, has also 50% of imported components. And it's normal, it's a part of the global economy nowadays, but we still have, we still need to have some tools to survive in case of a conflict. And we need to be competitive. If you have something of your own, you are holding a different negotiating position when you are negotiating with vendors and so on. So also machines. We used to have 90% of imported machines. Now it's 70%, so it's better. But still we have lots of critical industrial processes based on imported technologies. So the traditional estimates say that we spend about 1% of GDP for R&D. It's now maybe 1.09, something like that. It's a masochism to make these calculations. And these are the estimates from the Forecasting Institute. But if we are looking at imported technologies, they have about 1.5–2%. We spend about 1.5–2% GDP. So we spend 1% on developing our own and 2% on importing technologies, which changes our position in the world. And this is not only an issue of import substitution, it's the issue of how we envision our scientific and technical future. We keep talking about digitization, but I have a question about digitization. Scientific and technical development is not only about digitization, although digitization is important. The pandemic has reminded us that an even more important thing has to do with neuromedical technologies and pharma. Up to 30 or 40% of publications abroad on scientific subjects are devoted to healthcare. And our spending on healthcare R&D, even though we have a pretty good scientific school from the Soviet time and from the 2000s, we were able to develop Sputnik and other vaccines, but our spending on medical science is 0.04%. That's 10 times lower than in most developed countries, and we cannot ensure a high level of health and adapt to challenges of the pandemic and other unless we spend on medical science. And it's not only about money. Even this meager sum that is spent in Russia yields us results, but it's just a whole different level. Actually, if we're talking about the pandemic, if we take it literally, as before, there is no pandemic because 5% of the population has to get sick for it to be called a pandemic. But of course, this disaster is large scale, although some doctors are saying, well, now the situation has indeed changed, but traditionally, more people died from pneumonia than the number of people who died from COVID in 2020. People used to die of tuberculosis from such pandemics. But of course, now the scale of this disaster worldwide is different. And I'm not saying this in order to underestimate the threat or future threats. Sergey was talking, and Vladimir Salnikov were talking about these threats. It's just that we need to be always ready, and we need to realize that we are going to face these challenges in any case. And we cannot predict the disease or mortality rates. But if we are unprepared in terms of our infrastructure, if we are unprepared to any mass pandemic because of our medical infrastructure, well, our professionals warned us 8 years ago. But now we have seen it with our own eyes. I don't want to dive into this topic, but it's also a challenge for the industry, particularly in terms of medical technologies, equipment, and pharma. Pharma is growing pretty well by 20+% annually. This year it's going to be 18% maybe, but we are again critically dependent on the import, not only the import of medical drugs, but even substances or components for medicine that we produce ourselves. And we also have a huge problem of managing this process, of coordinating our efforts, of conducting clinical trials. They take 4 to 5 years on average. Even our scientists develop something now, we will see the result in 4 or 5 years. Nowhere in the world do they have such long terms of clinical trials. And this is another essential task. It's also important. This is another example of the need to create not only digitization of digital technologies. People are inspired by that, and unlike many other areas, a lot of money is spent on artificial intelligence and communications, about 70 billion, judging by the state digitization program until 2024. But the spending on medical science and equipment is incomparably smaller. And this industrial base for national healthcare is even more critical. The situation is even more critical here. So maybe we will create a great quantum computer, but this will not impact people's life quality as much as medical equipment. And the next thing, nevertheless, the industry, as I've said, it accounts for 1/4 of Russian GDP, but almost 90% of all R&D spending and engineering professionals are in the industry sector. But the problem is I cannot quote specific numbers, but unfortunately a significant share of that is in the defense industry. And the civil science is actually even dire straits. That's not a problem of science, but if we look at the solutions that are currently being developed within the so-called National Innovation System, and if we look at the state program of science and technology development, I would identify the following aspects. The state program of 1,200 billion for the next year doesn't mean a significant increase in spending. It's just that they accumulated the spending here that used to be spent on R&D by Rosatom and so on, except Roscosmos, whose activity is considered to be defense industry. Also, we need to coordinate efforts, not only spending. So this state program until 2024 actually reduces the spending on science, despite the optimistic performance indicator that says that private companies are going to invest. But our so-called private companies are Gazprom, Rostec, and so on, by a half or more. And if we look at the so-called innovative development programs of these companies until 2024, they are not planning to spend more on R&D. This level is stable. I'm not saying that they are not investing. Logos, owned by Rostec, is a private company, and it puts a lot of effort, and it has a great program on creating a serial microchip production, and it's developing software. It's developing new space machines, but space equipment, but that's below what was originally planned. Strategy is not just a document to achieve something. All strategies I know pretty specific documents about how to solve certain problems through private funds and public funds. The problem is, as far as I remember, the government has almost never lived up to the expectations and fulfilled its obligations. But it doesn't mean that if we spend some money on aerospace, for instance, there are still problems in the business. There are some breakthroughs. Yesterday, there was a forum called Composites Without Borders. Of course, borders always exist, but at that forum, they were discussing the happenings in the composite industry. The Soviet Union was one of the leaders by composite materials. But if we look at our production volumes, you can't compare it with China, Japan, or the US. But we have to admit that some targeted plants are being commissioned, like Rosatom plant in Alabuga, and there is a private firm, for example, Galen in Tatarstan, and several companies from Volgograd and other cities. So our fibers production has reached a comparable level with that of Japan and the US, which is a significant breakthrough. Moreover, we can actually make it to the top 5 globally in several years. But we need investments, we need developments, and we need teams, human teams, because when we are talking about our wishes, or when we are launching a big program on technical developments, we often forget about the professionals, about the humans. So there are big plans about technological developments. And by the way, we are also creating a center of fundamental physics and mathematics near Sarov. We are going to involve global scientists there and create a unique plant associated with a nuclear, laser and laser technologies. We have good results in nuclear technologies. IPG, for example, originated in Russia, even though it's currently American. That's why we have a certain standing, but the question is, what do we focus our efforts on? For example, we have a fast vehicle movement between Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's unpiloted delivery of cargoes to remote regions by the post of Russia. That's unmanned maritime vehicles along the northern sea route or in the Baltic so far. Electric cars, so-called personal assistants for sick people, for patients. I don't want to comment these projects. They are based on the projects from the National Technological Initiative. But in order to become a true driver of the economy and of the technology development, and we cannot replicate the nuclear project or the space project, although we have both nuclear and space. And by the way, when we are practicing masochism, and we see that we account for 0.5% of knowledge-intensive products in the global market, that does not include nuclear products, although it's nonsense. And a significant share of space technologies, although we are lagging behind there nowadays, because we used to have a good standing there, but space technologies are also not included in this percentage. So, you know, statistics is always skewed in someone's interest, but that's not what I wanted to say now. It's a challenge not only in terms of science, but also in terms of management. And the policy. What projects could we create to become such drivers? In my view, and this is an analytical picture that we have developed together with experts, and it's based on the agreements or so-called roadmaps that the government has signed or developed together with some leading companies in terms of technology breakthrough and applied science. I think this would matter more than these lighthouse projects within strategic initiatives. That's more of a venture component. But there are some realistic projects like genetic studies and biology program. It's funded through funds supported by Rosneft and other companies. So it's not oil industry, and it will have an impact on healthcare development. Then roadmaps on developing composite materials and other high-tech materials supported by Rosatom, but not only that. This has to do with artificial intelligence and different communication systems. This is supported by Sberbank, Rosatom, and a number of other companies. The next thing is vehicles and transport based on alternative energy sources, and not even hydrogen, but creating vehicles that run on batteries with smart control systems and creating a serial manufacturing of lithium-ion batteries. So far, we do not produce such batteries, and without them, we cannot have electric cars. Even buses that run in Moscow made of Chinese components by 80%, and almost half of their cost is the cost of the battery. But we are moving in that direction. Then we could work on algorithms of controlling energy systems. And again, we have some good foundation here on superconductivity. That's from the Soviet science. And the private business is now developing this. And it's a way of not only transmitting energy in different ways, but ensuring, but also providing spacecrafts and aircrafts with energy sources when we switch to electric aircrafts. I could talk a lot about it, but the essence is we need to have these technology projects, because as Yuri Vyacheslavovic said about the mega project, we actually don't have mega projects in our country. We don't have mega projects at all. The biggest mega project was the Sochi Olympics, about 1.5 trillion, and then the bridge in the Crimea. So that's it cost about 1 trillion altogether. We had no mega projects on a comparable scale. And they don't have to have mega cost. These projects should create the economy of the future, meaning the technologies and the quality of life. And in this respect, we actually have to come up with such projects and create a management system for them. And now a few words about the structure of our economy, just to understand where we are. So science and scientific developments, again, it's hard to talk about it, but if we count the added value, then it accounts for 3% of GDP, not 1% of the spending. But if we're talking about new approaches and a development not only of university science, because mostly the Academy of Sciences has the relevant professionals and some applied scientific centers. So when we develop the applied and academic science, we can identify this bottleneck, and if we solve it, then we can achieve 3% GDP. Then healthcare and education. At the moment, it's about 7% of added value and 9% together with communication. But in order to meet the life quality standards, we need to reach 15-17%, doubling this performance by 2030. Machine building, it's tiny, 2.8% of GDP. Again, in Germany, it's several times bigger. for us to provide our industrial base with that, we need to reach a higher level. So this takes into account the prices. We used to have 20% now. So, not even global prices matter here. So according to our estimate, this is going to reduce to 12 or 14% based on the price trends, because it cannot grow by more than 1.5 or 2%. But we need to understand that this fuel and energy sector will still be the leader in terms of driving the profits and revenue in the economic. Whatever happens with this whole global green economy, or even Russian green economy. And the next thing we underestimate is the commodities. That's chemistry, metallurgy, forestry. This is going to grow or decline. The demand for metals is supposed to decline, but because of the environmental concerns. But the chemistry is very much underdeveloped. If we that's about 0.9% of GDP with fertilizers. So if we want to have a performance comparable to the Saudi Arabia, not even mentioning Germany or the US, we must have much more chemical industry. So we have this improvement potential in the commodities sector here. I am not going to talk about other areas now. So the economy is awaiting huge structural shifts, but we still need to strike a balance between our, I would say, our belief that the digital will solve all our problems. So we need to develop the digital sector at all costs. Yes, it has to develop, but we need to digitize all areas, not just create this separate digitization sector, but we still need to be the leaders in the fuel and energy, and we mustn't disrupt other industries. So if we look at the statistics, the leader among all our industries is the fuel and energy sector, and it's because many technologies like seismic and deep drilling and some technology things about gas liquefaction, not to even to mention value-added chemistry. This is all a fuel and energy sector and the chemical industry. So we can say that the new industrial model is competitiveness, because we have to be competitive in the domestic market in terms of competing with the import and in the foreign markets, plus knowledge intensity, turning industry into applied science, so to say. And the third component is, of course, being green, adapting to climate change without overdoing it, and assessing cost effectiveness of these solutions. We still need to pursue them. Now, if we look at our industry, we are maybe number 8, and we are number 13 by processing industries, by manufacturing industries. And we could actually do much better if we improve the quality of our industry and the share of knowledge intensive and high-tech and medium-tech industry areas. This share can increase from 10 to 21-22% of GDP by 2030. Actually, the whole finance sector is also knowledge intensive. Then it's going to be an even greater share of GDP, maybe 30. So that's the task of creating a new structural picture of the economy, a new structure that will improve the population's income and combine development with environmental challenges.
Thank you very much for a very interesting report, although you spent a lot of time, but that was very interesting and a very good illustration. On the basis of our university, when we launched the Center of Innovative Technologies here at our university, we had to have both hardware equipment and the software, German one. And although we have nothing connected with the military. But the Germans did not want to give us, and we had to come to our honorary professor, Professor Emeritus Dr. Steinmeier, and he brought this permission personally. And again, the President Steinmeier will have to bring us this permission again. That sounds like a joke, but that's what happens in reality. And now the floor is yours. What's the role of business in the present situation? Can I have the remote, please? Dear colleagues, I'll try to be brief. And what I would like to talk about is about the entrepreneurs and technological startups. Who are those people? How can we do it that the best of them can stay in our country or in our region? That's the issue for the economic policy. And I will base my presentation on the research we've been conducting for the past 4 years, studying technological startups, which were created by entrepreneurs of Russian origin. A few words to explain what kind of research it is. First, the Russian entrepreneurs. These people are also Russian entrepreneurs in our research because they received their education in the Russian Federation. And of course, 95% of our entrepreneurs, the founders of startups, are those who are Russian by ethnicity. But we also include people of other nationalities who received education here. And we use Crunchbase as the basis of our research, although it's not perfect, but it's getting better and better. The major work we conducted throughout the year is we add information to Crunchbase, and we add information from LinkedIn, Facebook, and other databases about the headquarters of the company. And here you have the data, the upper left corner. At the moment, we have 2,900 founders who founded over 2,000 startups within the past 10 years. And on top, apart from Telegram, you ought to know, this is the top 10 in terms of investments. And only one headquarter is in Russia, in Moscow. The rest are somewhere else. And I think you know what Revolut Arrival is. I am not going to tell you about those enterprises. And here is the top 10 promising startups with the largest amount of investments of fund raised within 2019-2020. Here, none of the companies has its headquarters outside of the Russian Federation, although there are wonderful startups over here. Impress, this is a medical startup, and one of the most important people is from Spain, but Buke and Fridge No More are startups with the scooters you can see in our streets. And over here, I would like to draw your attention to how their location was changed, their jurisdiction changed. Starting back in 2018, the number of startups founded by the Russian entrepreneurs went down. And this trend for 2019-2020, that is maybe linked with imperfections in the database, but we can see the trend starting back in 2012, and they do not have explanations for that. But the next interesting bit of information, starting from 2012, if we talk about the jurisdiction, the number of startups founded in the Russian Federation decreased from 40% to 21%. So you can see it for yourselves. But do not pay attention to 2019, 2012, because many people have not defined their specific location yet. We cannot make any conclusions. And they go from the Russian Federation to Germany, to the United Kingdom, to Estonia. They create a lot of startups in Estonia, but they cannot raise a lot of funds over there. And here you have this terrible picture, overloaded with information. And here are the 3,000 startups created within the past decades and the investments they draw from countries. So about 1/3 of these startups stayed in Russia, and 2/3 opened up their headquarters somewhere else in other countries. And the Russian-based startup had raised about $11.2 billion, and with the exclusion of Telegram, even if we exclude Telegram, there will be about $8.5 billion, and about $1 million was raised by the companies headquartered in Russia. The rest of funds were raised in other countries, most of all in the USA and Britain. And they're comparable in terms of money, but in terms of number of startups, the USA is the leader. Also, Germany, Hong Kong are very important. InSilica was based in Hong Kong, Estonia, which I mentioned, and Singapore. To the right, in the right down corner, you can see the statistics. Who of these founders had studied in Moscow and then founded their startup in Moscow? About 43% of people who studied in Moscow stayed there. Kazan is also interesting. Although the number of startups is not large, yet about 30% of founders stayed in Kazan. There is a lot of useful information over here, and you can see the differences between Russians and others. They create more in the robotics. We create more startups in robotics and artificial intelligence, and abroad they have more startups in environment and green technologies. And here is the portrait of the founder, which is directly linked to our discussion and to what Vladimir Yefimovich was speaking about. Look to the diagram in the upper left corner. Many of them created their first startups while studying at the university. The next category is 1-25-35. It is going to become much smaller in the next years. And what does it suggest? Of course, we should influence these people while they are at the university. And it's about 20-25% of founders who found their startup while at the university, but the majority of them are out of the university. And you see that the majority received their experience having worked in, for example, 3 different companies and at around the age of 30. At the moment, the average age is 40 years. And when we try to make a general portrait of a startup, the most efficient ones are people with technical education, and those who received economic education abroad are also pretty efficient. And here we have top 15 startups from the Urals. And here we have the Ural Federal University plus Bashkortostan plus Perm. So several universities are taken here. And you can see that as far as location is concerned and as far as investments are concerned, raised funds, the first place is taken by Novosibirsk. And the rest are migrated to other countries. 6 startups created by the students of the Ural Federal University. But what we mean by saying the Ural Federal University, one of their education was received at the Ural Federal University. They could go to Stanford, for example, later on, or to other accelerators. So we know some of these people here. In the very end, Gainanov, Frolov, they are not very young, but there are also young people presented here. The last but one slide, 233 founders who received education in the Urals. About 200 startups were created, and 55, about 30% of them, have headquarters in Russia. But 33 of them moved from the Urals to Moscow. So we have only 22 left. Yekaterinburg is more or less representative. We have 72 people left, and 7 of them studied in, stayed in Yekaterinburg. That is 10%. I would not repeat the conclusions I already made. I would like to ask a question in the end. How can we increase the number of people who stay? Because these people lay the foundation for further development of innovative economy. So we have to make them stay, which creates very good prospects for our economic development in the future. I do not have a simple answer. One of the possible instruments we have to use, we conducted about 100 interviews with these people. One of the factors is gratitude to their alma mater. They are ready to invest their time to the university, to a business school they graduated from. And very often, the universities do not remember their own graduates, do not even recognize their own graduates. And we should understand that it's about networks. It's not one person separately. There is a network of relations, and they do not simply create one startup. They have friends and acquaintances which have other startups as well. And as for the state or federal support is concerned, rival wouldn't have been possible in Russia. That is about automobile industry. Of course, London is very much better for such startups because it gives access to the global markets. But it would be great if the federal support measures could offer access to Russian markets, could have easier access to the Russian markets. And there are other things. We noticed that there are successful startups in robotics and artificial intelligence. In such sectors, yes, we have this opportunity to make our people stay here. I'm sorry, I have used too much time. Thank you very much, and it was a very interesting research, and I hope you will continue your research. The case is very clear and very important. We discuss these things, and this is one of the initiatives of the government out of 41 initiatives is aimed at creating startup studios at the universities, and we create such studios, but without such analysis, without understanding what is to be done and what we should focus on and what hypotheses are going to work, we just cannot do it without your research. And I hope that your research will help us understand where to go. Now we go back to the regions, and it is very important which new trends have appeared in the regions and what the condition is of the regional budgets, what's going to happen. And we would like Mr. Klemanov to talk about that. He is the director of the Regional Policy Development in the Russian Academy of Sciences. And thank you very much. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I would like to draw your attention to the new role of the regions they received during the crisis. It is forced decentralization when regions received more opportunities and more power, but do they have more resources? We'll have to look at it. And the regions differ in their behavior from each other and from the country in general, and different industries behaved in different way. There are new opportunities for growth, and we will look at these opportunities. And also, we remember that our regions are very different, and they differ in their behavior in the post-crisis situation, which sets a new agenda. So first, I will give you some information about the regional budgets in the budgetary sector of our country. And the crisis situation has not changed it much. The income, it's not even 1/3 if we take away the transfers between the budgets. There is this stable position, and it shows us the stupidity of those illusions we had 2 decades ago when we hoped that half of the income should go back to the regional budgets. In reality, that's about 1/3. And what situation we have right now about the regional budgets? To the left, we have red dots and green dots showing whether we have deficit or profit. And we see that throughout 2010s, all regions in general had a deficit. They lacked resources, and the Ministry for the Finance of the Russian Federation eventually brought the regions to profit. But then the trend was changed, and the regions again came back to this situation. And the explanation is very simple. The regions have a lot of obligations, and their income is not growing. Here on this picture, you can see to the right, you can see the responsibilities of the regions. They have to be financially responsible for that. And you see that the financial responsibility, because of the new laws and regulations after the reforms of 2000, the financial responsibilities grew twofold, and the municipalities also received much more financial responsibilities, but they do not have the financial resources for that, and that's nonsense. Besides, regions are different in terms of federal financial support. There are regions which receive about 70 or even 80% of their income from, or up to 90% of their income from the federal budget. That is, for example, South Siberia and Caucasus. And during the crisis, this ratio remained the same as it had been throughout the previous years. They still receive up to 90% of their income, irrespective of the new structure, the new system of transfers between the budgets which exist right now. And here you can see that the Caucasus and the Far Eastern region received slightly less rather than they used to receive before the crisis. How the structure of their income, of the regional income, changed. We can see that in 2020, for the first time, we received growth of transfers from federal budget to regional budgets, and it has never happened before, such a huge growth of transfers from the federal to regional budgets, and it created a new construct when the regional budgets started receiving much more money from the federal budget. And this trend has not stopped in 2020. And we have to think it over. We have to consider this change. In 2021, we still have this growth of transfers from the federal budget to the regional ones. And the income of the regional budget increased. And it's very difficult to understand the ratio of the most important factors over here. For example, income tax, which went lower, and profit tax, which increased dramatically. And when we discuss the regional budgets, we should remember that about 20% of regional budgets is the budget of the city of Moscow. And for the next year, we should think about the growth of budget of St. Petersburg. It's going to grow very fast. I do not think we have ever witnessed such a growth as the growth of St. Petersburg expected for the next year. What else can we say? Regions are very, very different, and we should find some indices which would demonstrate how differently regions behave during crisis. We can talk about some general parameters, but we'd better think about very detailed parameters which would emphasize the differences between regions during the pandemics. And you see here the comparison between 2019 and 2020 from the central district to Far Eastern district. And you can see that the income, the wages used to grow in the same way, but the retail was very different from region to region. And restaurants and cafes, we can see that differences are huge between regions. And here you can try and find some trends over here. It's very difficult to find specific trends, some regularities over here, but of course everything is so very different. Some regions grew, some regions fell down. The same about the most important income things. For example, the income of physical entities, you can see that it has grown, although we have these illusions. We've been thinking about wages going down. It has been mentioned that the income of the population went down. No, the wages grew. Well, it was different in different industries, but overall there was a growth of wages. And as for income tax, it is completely unpredictable and completely different, and absolutely different factors influence the behavior of that text. I cannot go into many details over here, but I can tell you that there are several new trends in relations between the federal authorities and the regional authorities, and there is a corresponding program approved of by the Ministry of Finance. They have discussed some parameters, and sometimes we read it as a mantra. We have to create more independency in the regions. And I remember the words of the president that we were going to discuss it, but there was no such discussion. And we still keep on talking that we should make our regions financially stable and sustainable, but there are only words. There are no solutions yet. So what do we have in 2021? Everybody became kind of reassured, kind of calm, because in the first half of the year 2021, there is growth of income by 19 to 22%, and it is even better rather than it used to be in most optimistic forecasts. In metallurgy, for example, in Lipetsk, Novgorod Oblast, the maximum of growth has been noticed, and people can become very optimistic about that, and we can hear reassuring voices that everything is going to be great. But on the other hand, the volume of transfers is the same. It remains completely the same. So this increased support of the federal authorities to the regional authorities remains the same. And that is why regional budgets have this huge proficit. But we will see what's going to happen by the end of the year. And we can come back to the regions and the new construct of the new relations between the federation and the regions. And these new relations are connected both with the increased support from the federation, but also we understand that the regions should be involved into pursuing federal goals, the sustainable goals and the innovative goals and the green objectives of the federal programs. And we see that there is a lot of manual management, micromanagement, and we have individual programs, which we used to have back in 1990s. And starting from 2020, there are more individual programs like that. And there is a completely new agenda when the Prime Minister himself goes to the regions, or vice ministers curate specific macro-regions. And we also set our priorities on developing infrastructure and dwelling construction in the regions. And we also move towards credits and loans. And here on this picture, you can see that the amount of federal transfers, which is shown in the green, interbudgetary transfers in the income, which has never happened again. You can see that the debts grow, the debts of the regions. This is the red line, and the blue line are loans. And this situation is exacerbated recently. Now you see that in 2021, the state debt increases, and the new initiative of the federal center, for example, giving out more loans for 500 billion rubles. These new initiatives will not be calculated in the debts of our regions. So all in all, there will be 2.3 trillion debt plus about 500 billion. That much loans will be distributed among the regions. And we can see in the blue the ratio over here. And when the regions owe so much to the federation, to the federal government, that is kind of strange. That is kind of a disbalance. Besides, coming back to this micromanagement and manual management, we can also say that the regions should find ways to make their contribution into the federal objectives of development. And there are already documents prepared where they specify the role of the regions. And again, we have different types of inter-budgetary transfers, and the money sent from the federation to the regions are aimed at pushing the regions in the right direction. And the priorities of our government are demonstrated over here. And I calculated about 30 times Prime Minister went to the regions. And after that, 47.3 billion rubles were sent to the regions. And there were other instruments of support. And I think when the Prime Minister came to Sverdlovsk Oblast, that was quite a new thing, and it brought about some new investment programs. And this new reality we have to live with. Thank you so much for your attention. I stop over here. Yes, for the Ural Federal University, the visit of the Prime Minister gave a new opportunity to build a brilliant campus of world renown. And now we will get back to the regional cases, Tatarstan and Udmurtia. We will have these cases, and please, we have 7 minutes left, and please try to fit in. Yes, we can hear you, we can see you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It was great to listen to these interesting and fundamental things you've been saying, how our economy is developing. And it's good. Good news is that the pandemic and the whole situation, it happens not only in our country, but all over the world. And I think that in terms of competitiveness, it does not change a lot, because all of us undergo these new conditions, and we have to compete both as a country, as the Russian Federation, and as separate regions. And inside Russia, we also have to compete for investments, be they investments from the state or from private investors. We used to complain that we have some infrastructure limitations. For example, our roads are bad, our logistics not very good. But within the last few years, we've been building wonderful roads like M12 and other roads, which are very important and which are very good sign for our investors or potential investors. But what is very important right now is human resources, human capital, and any investment project has the bottleneck, be it a large enterprise or a small enterprise, the bottleneck is the human resources. My colleagues have already spoken about that, and we have to compete here as well. When we look at the practice of other countries like Europe, for example, when regions have investment projects, they start competing for human resources. And we have to think of our regions not only as investment opportunities, but as the place where people will have to live and work. And we have to think of the environment created in the region. So on the regional level, we have to focus on this aspect. And that's what we are doing here in Tatarstan within the framework of developing Kazan agglomeration. There appear new districts, new satellite cities next to Kazan. And when we look at the statistical data, more than half of the people living here migrated from other regions. They are not from Kazan. So people hear that Kazan invests in its infrastructure, invests into the environment, invests into the people, improves schools, kindergartens, parks, builds new dwelling areas suited to the dwellers. And this is very important to improve our and develop our human resource upon which we can base our investment processes. And I think on the regional level, many regions have to focus their attention on such things. And we have to analyze how much we need this human resource. And that should be the starting point for our educational programs and brush-up courses, re-educational courses. For example, what we had in the Republic of Tatarstan here. And what is very important is to inform your population about that. Here we have about 10 regions present at this conference. And these regions would like to bring in new people into their regions, and the mobility of our population is getting better. We know that when people can implement their ideas somewhere, they are ready to move to a different region if that region has the necessary infrastructure and has a suitable environment. But what is also important here, we as regional investors, we used to think of regions only as investment places. Right now, we should promote them as good places to live, good places to work at. So this is a very important thing I would like to draw your attention to. It's not only the investment potential we should promote. No, we should promote the regions as good places for living and good places for working. And it's not only about inviting specialists, but from the Russian Federation, but also in terms of inviting specialists from abroad, from the post-Soviet countries and other countries. The market is very competitive and we should promote ourselves. In general, the dynamics of promoting our projects and implementing new technologies, the dynamics is positive and we are happy about that. When we work with foreign investors, especially with the third world countries, we often hear that they think that the Russian Federation is a country with highly developed technologies, and they would like to participate in development and implementation of these technologies, and they would like to use these technologies back in their own countries. And we should think about investing in this sector as well. And of course, foreign investors would like to have guarantees both from the region and from the Russian Federation in general. And our development institutions like Внешэкономбанк and other structures should play a bigger role to support joint development of technological processes on the territory of the Russian Federation, so that these projects can be disseminated to other countries. We have such investors, but we should promote everything to the outer world. We should show that we are ready to promote these technologies. Thank you so much. The last phrase is very well remembered. And now we have the last presentation from Udmurtia. You have the floor for the final speech. Good afternoon, dear participants, and thank you very much for having me. I'm from Udmurtia. I'm the head of the Development Cooperation, and when we discuss the priorities we have and we orient at, I would like to talk about the structure of our economy. Udmurtia is an industrialized region. About 55% is about industry, and it's mostly military industrial complex and oil production. Both are very heavily dependent on external factors we have no opportunity to influence, and any negative tendencies on the global market correlates with negative consequences on our market. And that is why we need actors here who are not all that connected with the outer factors. That is, for example, small size business, and it is 1/4 of our budget. So basically, it's our stable income. And that is why we would like to pay a lot of attention to development of medium-sized and small business. In 2020, we made some benefits and allowances for the entrepreneurs from other regions. We decreased the taxes for them for the years 2022-23. We continued the favorable conditions for them, and we expect the business which had left Udmurtia to come back. We call it relocation, back relocation of our business. And we also remember the people who had been working here from the very beginning. And we stop this taxation for small and medium-sized business. There was a transition from one taxation system to another, and we tried to make this transition for taxation easier for small and medium-sized business. About 11,000 of our small-size businesses used our help in this smooth transfer from one taxation to another. And right now, at the backdrop of pandemics, we also try to help creative entrepreneurs which deal in sports, in food industry, in entertainment industry, and we decreased taxes for them. And about 1,500 entrepreneurs already used this opportunity to have easier taxation. We also give consultations to local businesses how to deal with different issues here. We also promote exports, and we also try to improve investment situation. We work with exporting companies, and we managed to increase the export by 92%, and this is the hugest growth of non-fuel growth. And we are 7th in Russia in terms of the speed of growth of non-fuel export. And we do work not only with medium-sized and small enterprises, we work with large enterprises as well. This year, we gave about 500 million rubles to large enterprises. We help them with leasing, with setting up new industries and new production lines, and we help them to receive federal support. And in 2020, we managed to bring in development grants to the sum over 180 billion rubles from the federal budget. And as for supporting investment activities, we have a lot of nice things in the program 1740. We have 11 projects in Udmurtia supported by the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. And we prepare other projects as well to be supported by that ministry. Besides, we use such measure of support as benefits and allowances in terms of taxation, and we also issue land plots to entrepreneurs. And I'm short of time, I'm sorry. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your presentations, and we understood from your presentation and from other presentations, although they say that hope dies last, but our hopes do not die despite the pandemics. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, and we proceed.